Premier Danielle Smith will invoke the Alberta Sovereignty Within United Canada Act to counter the Liberals' oil and gas emissions cap. Also on the show today, we'll be discussing the Alberta UCP's recent vote to increase the accommodation allowance of MLAs, which led to backlash from opposition parties given the cost of living crisis being experienced by everyday Albertans. We'll also talk about the province's newest insurance reforms, which caused quite the uproar online. Additionally, we'll be reconnecting with an old friend, former host of the show Rachel Parker, who called out CTV for criticizing Smith for proposing solutions to the Trump tariffs. We'll also take a broader look at all the premiers who spoke out against the tariffs following the First Minister's meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'm Isaac Lamoureux, your host of the Alberta Roundup, and let's hop into that first story now. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith announced on Tuesday, alongside the province's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schultz, and Minister of Energy, Brian Jean, that the Sovereignty Act would protect the province from federal overreach through its production cap. Smith said the following about the legality of the cap.
We've been very clear that we will use all means at our disposal to fight back against federal policies that hurt Alberta, and that's exactly what we're doing. On November the 4th, Ottawa released details of its oil and gas emissions cap, which is a de facto production cap. The cap violates Section 92A of the Constitution, which clearly gives provinces exclusive jurisdiction over non-renewable natural resource development. Ottawa seems to think that they need to save us from ourselves, but they are wrong, because we're not just working with industry to continue to drive down emissions, we're succeeding at it. Alberta already has a system in place that is working. Emissions per barrel are declining, even as production and contribution to GDP grows. Alberta's energy industry doesn't just provide jobs to Albertans, but to Canadians all across our country. And it doesn't just power Alberta's economy, it powers Canada's.
Despite numerous warnings from economists that the emissions cap will have a negative impact on the Canadian economy, the Trudeau government has pushed forward. A report from the Conference Board of Canada estimates that the cap will result in the average Canadian family having $419 less a month for groceries, utility, and mortgage payments. The report highlighted that the cap would reduce Canada's GDP by up to $1 trillion between 2030 and 2040. An S&P study highlighted that the cap would cut production of oil by 2 million barrels daily. Alberta launched a national advertising campaign in October, warning Canadians against the consequences of a federal emissions cap. Smith said the advertising campaign's goal was to warn everyone who stands to lose something from the cap, which is all Canadians, about the risks. She previously called the oil and gas cap a, quote, deranged vendetta targeting Alberta. The Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act motion must be passed in the legislature. The motion proposes launching an immediate constitutional challenge against the emissions cap. The motion seeks to ensure no provincial entity enforces the cap while designating oil and gas facilities as essential infrastructure. It also prohibits unauthorized access to these facilities. It declares emissions data proprietary to Alberta and mandates that disclosure be controlled by the province. Additionally, it establishes royalty-in-kind programs for oil and bitumen. It aims to expand pipeline capacity through collaboration with other jurisdictions. Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz said that the cap would make life less affordable for Canadians while having no impact on reducing global emissions. In fact, she said that the cap will increase the production of coal and other high emissions energy worldwide. She said the following.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Premier, for your leadership in this area. After years of trying to reason with this out-of-touch federal government, our province faces a choice. Secure our economic future and the livelihoods of all Albertans, or let Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sacrifice our prosperity for his extreme ideological agenda. The federal government should not be willing to undercut Alberta's economy just because we don't vote for them. They seem to just be trying to placate their eco-activist base in Ottawa as they collapse in the polls. They are chasing headlines and sound bites while playing politics once again with people's livelihoods. This is unacceptable. We voiced these concerns to Ottawa many, many times, only to be dismissed and ignored. We will not be sidelined or silenced.
She added that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is telling Canadians to prioritize Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault's green agenda over feeding their families or paying their rent. She said the province will use the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Agency to market its resources directly and independently. The agency was established by Peter Lougheed in 1973 to defend constitutional rights in the war against oil and gas waged by Trudeau's father. So hopping into our next story here, Alberta's United Conservative Party recently voted to increase their MLAs accommodation allowance by 14%. The decision resulted in opposition members questioning the reasoning for the raise while everyday Albertans are struggling to get by. Alberta NDP MLA Luann Metz was one of the members who spoke out. She said Albertans want their provincial government focused on healthcare, education, public safety, affordability, and the economy. She said, quote, "The government's focus and priorities are incredibly warped." However, a spokesperson for the Alberta UCP told me that the 14% increase, which raises the monthly accommodation allowance from $1,930 to $2,200 a month, is the first increase since 2012. The spokesperson added that the Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation, has increased by 32% in the same time period. The spokesperson said, quote, "The increase brings Alberta closer in line with residency allowances offered in other jurisdictions, such as the House of Commons and Ontario, while remaining below their levels." The spokesperson added, quote, "The adjustment is a standard business practice designed to ensure that MLAs representing constituencies outside the Edmonton metropolitan area have appropriate resources to fulfill their professional duties." According to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta's Consolidated Members' Service Committee orders, members are eligible for accommodation allowances for every day they maintain a temporary residence in or near Edmonton, when the Legislative Assembly is in session or when it is not sitting but they remain near Edmonton on official business. Any claims for the allowance must be supported by documentation highlighting the member's stay-in, ownership, or lease of a temporary residence. Rentals.ca's November rent report showed that the average one-bedroom rental price in Edmonton is $1,384 a month. The average rent for all types of accommodation in the city was $1,584 a month. Across the country, the average rent was $2,152 a month. The province's recent second fiscal update of the year highlighted another increase in its expected surplus, now rising further to $4.6 billion in 2024, growing $4.2 billion or 12.5-fold from the initial projection of $367 million. Switching gears now to a story that occurred late last week, the provincial government and its residents did not seem to be seeing eye to eye when it comes to the latest auto insurance reforms proposed by the province. You can let me know in the comments about your thoughts on the proposed changes. The province announced a new auto insurance system that it argued would provide better and faster auto insurance services to Albertans while reducing premiums. The new care-focused system is intended to replace the current court-based system. Smith had the following to say about the changes.
In a nutshell, under the new system, if someone is injured in a collision, they'll get the necessary care and benefits, whether they're at fault or not, without the need to litigate. No more costly legal battles, no more drawn-out waits for care. Instead, Albertans who suffer serious injuries will be able to rely on treatment until they are recovered. Albertans who suffer catastrophic, life-changing injuries would be able to rely on treatment and care for the rest of their lives. This is a care-focused system. Instead of forcing people through complex legal processes in order to get the treatment that they need, the system default will be that those injured in collisions get the care they need to recover. You could call it better, faster service. And these better, faster services would be delivered at a savings of up to $400 per year on insurance premiums.
The provincial government said it heard from 16,000 Albertans in online surveys, which drove the changes to the insurance policies. According to the survey's responses, 95% of Albertans agreed that bad drivers should pay more for their insurance. 8 in 10 said that they wanted to pay the lowest possible cost for their insurance, while 73% believed it was important to be able to sue at-fault drivers. However, more than 6 in 10 said they would not need the right to sue if their insurance company supported their needs. Smith posted the entire press conference to X, and while the post only had half as many comments as likes, a large portion of them were negative. One of the most liked comments highlighted that Albertans pay the highest auto insurance premiums in the country. Based on the numbers provided, a $400 yearly saving would not change the province's rank. One user said, quote, "Not acceptable. We have the highest rates in the country. And yet you give the go-ahead to raise premiums another 7.5% per year over 2 years with the hopes that these companies will suddenly become cheaper because of no-fault insurance. Your math is adding up like Trudeau's. The debt will pay itself off." However, Finance Minister Nate Horner said that classifying the new insurance system as no fault is misleading. He said, quote, "Some will categorize this Care First system as no fault. I really think that's a misleading label and just not right. Under this model, fault still matters. Bad drivers will continue to pay more in premiums. Drivers will be held accountable for their actions." Despite the negative reaction online, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Finance told me that asserting people were reacting negatively was, quote, premature. The spokesperson said, quote, "There are parties with a vested interest in ensuring litigation costs and the status quo of poor benefits for expensive costs remain in place, and they are spreading misinformation on the changes. These changes will provide better, faster, and cheaper auto insurance to Albertans when implemented in January 2027, and we look forward to ensuring the 3.4 million drivers in the country save money." The spokesperson added that for every dollar taken by insurance companies, they pay $1.17 in settlements, with some paying as much as $1.40. The spokesperson added, quote, "Most will continue to lose money under the increased cap, leading to more leaving the province between now and January 2027. We are taking action to protect Albertans from rampant premium insurances until they can see savings under the Care First system." As previously mentioned, the new system is not set to be fully implemented until January 2027. It will require legislation to be introduced in the spring of 2025. In the interim, starting January 2025, the good driver rate cap will be increased to 7.5%. It is currently 3.7%. Horner said, quote, "We know an increase in the rate cap is not ideal for Albertans. This wasn't something we wanted to do. It's clear that auto insurance companies are not blameless in this situation either, but the current situation is not about profitability, it's about viability. Many companies are losing millions under the current cap system, and we have chosen to limit the cap as much as possible in the face of escalating costs. 2 insurers have already decided to leave our market, and others could potentially follow without some adjustments to the cap." Now revisiting a post from an old friend, Rachel Parker, who of course was the former host of the Alberta Roundup, she said, quote, "CTV News is upset that Premier Smith put forward tangible solutions to avoid tariffs instead of bleep and moaning like other useless politicians." Highlighting some of the top comments from the post, which may be from listeners of this very show. For example, Andrew Noel said, quote, "Danielle Smith's big mistake. She's trying to have a grown-up conversation with news agencies. These are people who don't think there's an issue with Canada right now, so why would they admit that things need to change?" Another user, Stan, said, quote, "Danielle once again proving to all why she's the best premier in the country." And lastly, friend of True North and Alberta director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Chris Sims, said, quote, "Exactly. Fix the problem or get out of the way." Let me know in the comments how you feel about Smith's response to the tariffs and what more you'd like to see. Speaking of the response to tariffs, for our last story today, we'll cover the recent First Ministers meeting held between the country's premiers and Justin Trudeau. Trudeau and Canada's premiers convened on Wednesday to address President-elect Donald Trump's pledge to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian imports unless Canada enhances its border security. Trump said the tariff would remain in effect until illegal immigrants and drugs like fentanyl stop pouring over the border. Trump wrote in a post to Truth Social, quote, "Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long-simmering problem. We hereby demand that they use this power, and until such time that they do, it is time for them to pay a very big price." So Canada exported $439.6 billion worth of goods to the United States in 2023, accounting for 76% of the country's total exports. While not all of Canada's premiers mentioned what they discussed in the meeting, some did, and came out with their proposed policies. For example, Smith said that Trump's concerns about illegal immigrants and drug smuggling at the Canada-US border were valid. She said, quote, "I communicated this very clearly to the Prime Minister, and further indicated that Alberta will be acting urgently and decisively to patrol our own shared border with Montana, with more details to be announced soon in that regard. I also expressed the need for the federal government to aggressively move up compliance with our country's NATO obligations of a 2% GDP spend on our military forces, which is yet another concrete way to solidify our economic and military alliance with the United States. Smith also used the meeting to discuss the importance of energy security and partnering with the United States, urging the Prime Minister to halt his planned production cap, which she of course will invoke the Sovereignty Act to combat should it not be cancelled. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe also spoke out about the meeting. He shared a clip where he discussed the issues at a separate conference. He said, quote, "I think all Canadians would be in favor of ensuring that our borders are secure. Thus, our nation is secure when it comes to people that are coming in illegally. When it comes to the drugs that are coming in and the scourge of drugs and the poison that we see in our communities today, it's very, very different than when I was growing up." Moe suggested that the Liberals bring in the Canada Border Services Agency and Military Coast Guard to secure the border. He said this could work towards the country hitting its 2% of GDP NATO spending requirements. Some other premiers issued statements confirming they attended the meeting, but were less clear in what specifics they requested from the Liberals or from other premiers. For example, Quebec Premier François Legault said that he asked the Liberals to provide a detailed plan on how they plan to improve border security without getting into any further specifics. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has also called on Trudeau to enhance border security despite calling the proposed tariff a, quote, unjustified threat. Around 6 times more terrorists were apprehended between 2022 and 2024 at the Canada-US border compared to the southern border the United States shares with Mexico. So firstly, Poilievre called on Trudeau to cancel his quadrupling of the carbon tax. In fact, he further called on the Prime Minister to halt all tax increases. The Conservative leader then joined Smith's call to urge Trudeau to stop his energy emissions cap. Poilievre said, quote, "The incoming American president says he wants to cut gas prices in half. Well, the only way to do it will be to import more clean Canadian energy. So the Prime Minister has to stop this assault on our biggest industry." Poilievre also urged Trudeau to cancel his billion-dollar cut to the military. Lastly, Poilievre pleaded with Trudeau to stop his, quote, liberalization of drugs. In fact, take a listen to what Poilievre had to say of Canada's drug problem.
"I don't want to stop drug overdoses to please Donald Trump. I want to stop drug overdoses so that there's not one more mother with her face buried in a pillow sobbing that she just lost her kid after 47,000 other Canadians have died. That's more than we lost in the Second World War. A 200% annual increase in drug overdose deaths have resulted from Justin Trudeau's radical liberalization of drugs. Justin Trudeau must put partisanship aside, not just for the sake of Team Canada, but for the sake of our people, and fully reverse his liberalization of drugs.
Trudeau confirmed after meeting with the premiers that he did in fact meet with them. He said, quote, "Our focus, Canadian jobs, securing the border, and building on our strong partnership with the United States." So that wraps up our stories for this week, but let's hop into the comment roundup now. There were a lot of great comments from last week, and I always find it a great challenge to choose between them all. I bet you thought we could get through an entire episode without talking about Randy Boissonnault, but we're going to discuss him in the first comment as there were so many about him in the last show. So at Wes Wojcichin said, quote, "He should resign and be criminally charged and prosecuted if convicted. He should have jail time and lose his federal pension and other benefits. Canada needs these corrupt politicians and others criminally punished also. Politicians are not above the law." So yeah, I chose to highlight this comment particularly for the last sentence because, of course, I agree, and I think generally most Canadians do, that politicians should not be above the law. And yet, with the many scandals we've seen in government, they no longer really seem to be held to account. I'm wondering what you think might occur if Boissonnault was made an example of and prosecuted. Would him being charged change how politicians behave? Sticking with politicians, the next comment comes from @FAC, who said, quote, "Mandatory drug testing for all elected officials. Other public job sectors require it. Canadians should be demanding mandatory/random drug testing for our elected politicians." Yeah, so I really don't feel like this is a far-fetched request. I mean, it seems reasonable enough of an expectation for our politicians and elected officials to not take drugs. I'm curious if something like this was implemented, how many would fail? The next comment comes from @PatrickReed2767, who said, quote, "It is scary to think the next Edmonton police chief will be hired with DEI. Now just imagine who it will be." Yeah, obviously as an Edmonton resident, this is certainly a fear that I share. However, I will say that many organizations have recently been straying away from DEI policies, although these of course were private organizations. So I'm curious to ask, how long do you think it will take for federal institutions to follow suit and realize the epic failure that is DEI? Lastly, I want to discuss the many comments that listeners made about Stephen Harper. There seemed to be a relatively common theme that many of you were happy with the economic job that Harper did, but critical of other aspects of his governance. But of course, given the economic trouble our country is in, it's hard to imagine that we'd be in a comparable situation with Harper as PM, as some of you rightfully noted. For example, Andrew Baldwin 4454 said, quote, "I voted for Stephen Harper every chance I could. But just the same, I am mystified if it is really true that a lot of people think that Harper was the best Conservative PM ever. McDonald was the best, Ben Mulroney was runner-up, and Harper might not even make the podium because Borden was a very consequential PM too." Read Mulroney's memoirs, Isaac, if you haven't already done so, and see if you still think that Harper was the better PM. I mean, thanks for the advice, Andrew. I'll give that a read this weekend. Another user @DaveJohnson3773 said of the economy, quote, "Turns out we should have kept Harper because we would not be in the position we are right now," which pretty much speaks to the previous points I covered. Anyways, that wraps up our comment roundup and this week's show. My name's Isaac Lamoureux, your host of the Alberta Roundup. Have a great weekend. Thank you and God bless. May Alberta prosper, strong and free.